With human rights. China has also weighed in. A foreign ministry spokesman replied to a US State Department tweet about Hong Kong with the words, "I can't breathe." The editor of the state-run Global Times also drew parallels to the US response to Hong Kong protesters. And Iran's foreign minister posted this edited version of a statement from Mike Pompeo's protests in Iran. And its foreign ministry spokesman accused the US of pursuing violence at both home and abroad.
We deeply regret to see the American people who peacefully seek respect and no more violence are suppressed indiscriminately and met with the utmost violence. And to the American officials and police, stop violence against your people and let them breathe.
Well, the unrest in the US has sparked plenty of reactions, including from several celebrities. High-profile stars have used their status to speak out against the death of George Floyd, and in some cases they've even taken to the streets themselves. Here's Manny Tsigas.
These are some of the high-profile names who've used their platform to address the growing unrest across the United States. Their messages range from measured to mortified, impassioned to enraged. And somehow rapper Killer Mike managed to blend all of those emotions and more when he was persuaded to speak at a press conference over the weekend while protests raged on the streets of Atlanta.
I'm mad as hell. I woke up wanting to see the world burn down yesterday because I'm tired of seeing black men die. He casually put his knee on a human being's neck for 9 minutes as he died like a zebra in the clutch of a lion's jaw. And we watch it like murder porn over and over again. So that's why children are burning to the ground. They don't know what else to do. And it is the responsibility of us to make this better right now.
The devastation even persuaded a usually apolitical figure to speak up. In a statement, basketball legend Michael Jordan said he was deeply saddened, truly pained and plain angry at the situation, adding that he stood with those calling out the ingrained racism and violence towards people of colour. Others have taken aim at US President Donald Trump, including singer Lady Gaga. "We have known for a long time that President Trump has failed," she wrote in a statement. "He holds the most powerful office in the world, yet offers nothing but ignorance and prejudice while black lives continue to be taken." Another singer, Billie Eilish, was even more scathing. In a lengthy post peppered with expletives, she blasted those who argue all lives matter as opposed to Black Lives Matter. "Society gives you privilege just for being white," she wrote. "If all lives matter, why are black people killed for just being black?" The climate has even seen some celebrities take to the streets themselves, but as actor John Cusack discovered while filming protests in Chicago, the police can be just as hostile to them. Singer Halsey claims she was shot twice by rubber bullets while marching in Los Angeles. Others spotted on the streets range from pop stars like Ariana Grande and Paris Jackson to actors Michael B. Jordan and Nick Cannon. But ultimately, when the anger subsides, what will it all amount to? The answer, according to Killer Mike, is a different kind of action.
If you sit in your homes tonight, instead of burning your home to the ground, you will have time to properly plot, plan, strategize and organize and mobilize in an effective way. And two of the most effective ways is first taking your butt to the computer and making sure you fill out your census so that people know who you are and where you are. The next thing is making sure you exercise your political bully power and going to local elections. We have to be better than burning down our own homes, because if we lose Atlanta, what else we got?
Well, Tom Nolan is a former Boston police officer and a former policy advisor at the Department of Homeland Security in Washington. He says systemic racism in police forces is rife.
Instances of arson and destruction of property, vandalism, and throwing some projectiles and that kind of behavior at police. So I think this is going to continue unabated through the next several nights. And the numbers speak to this issue. The police in the United States kill over 1,000 people a year, while the typical loss of life for police officers is about 50. The likelihood of an African-American man being killed by the police in the United States is 3.5 times higher than their white counterparts. So just that statement like that is just a gratuitous manifestation of ignorance of what the reality is of policing in the United States in 2020.
Well, Steve Herman is the White House Bureau Chief for Voice of America. He joins us live from Alexandria, just outside DC. Steve, talking to you on a very difficult time. We hear there a former White House advisor saying that, in fact, there is systemic racism throughout police forces. Now, this is something the White House is saying very strongly is not the case. What are they saying about this issue across the country?
Well, a denial of that came on a Sunday talk show from the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. And of course, if you've been paying attention to the president's rhetoric over the past couple of days, he has not been addressing that issue in that manner. Instead, he's primarily been tweeting about the need for law and order. So a very different tone coming out of the White House so far. But there are indications that the president will probably have to make a national address, that his supporters are calling for that. We know White House aides have been contemplating that for the past couple of days. He did make some remarks when he was in Florida for the space launch on Saturday, right at the top of his formal prepared remarks. But the tone on Twitter since then has been much different, and a lot has happened here since then, Bev.
Of course, and if he is, though, to do that national address, Steve, would it not be very critical that there is an agreed path to take? Because he has been targeting probably those on the left, calling for looters to be shot, declaring anti-fascist groups to be terrorist organisations. Now, that impact must have been felt throughout those protests across the country.
Well, we're 3.5 years into this presidency, and time again, when the president has addressed the nation, there have always been changes to the prepared text or ad-lib comments made by the president, where he steps on his own message a few minutes or hours or days later when he's talking to the media or he gets on Twitter. So there is some skepticism that even if the president does give a national address, would it actually be able to calm things out on the streets? Does he really have credibility with these people who are protesting, including those who have been very near the White House and setting fires and looting stores in the past couple of days? And the answer is probably not.
And to that point, I mean, as you point out, Washington has literally been on fire. Why has the capital, the national capital, been hit so badly? Is it because it is the centre of government, or is it Washington, which we know has a lot of these kind of issues throughout the city?
Yes, I don't think what's been happening in Washington, D.C. has been any worse than what we've seen in Southern California or in New York or in some other cities, Atlanta, for example. But of course, there's much more focus on it happening here because this is the seat of power, and the president is physically in the White House. He was there Friday and Saturday night, and so he could hear what was going on. And if he looked out the bedroom of his residence, he certainly could have seen the fire that was set on the edge of Lafayette Park last evening.
The National Guard is on the streets in 15 states. Do you think they are going to be able to calm things down?
The problem is what message does the National Guard send? They're supposed to just be a support force for law enforcement. They're not a law enforcement unit. They're supposed to be under the control of state governors, but they are military units. And what is their discipline going to be? Are they going to be seen as a calming force to reassure business owners and the general public? Or are they even going to incite more violence because of the image that's put forward by having the military on the streets of the United States?
We've talked over the years, Steve, about the sort of divide that the American is now in. Do you think Donald Trump's presidency has contributed to the scale of the protests we're seeing, this movement across the state at the moment?
Well, what I've seen with the protesters who have been in Lafayette Park, while there's been some graffiti scrawled with obscenities mentioning the president's name, but the chants have been very much on message with what we've seen across the country. They're not being drawn there, I think, necessarily because Donald Trump is in the White House. So he's certainly not been a calming presence. I don't think what we're going to see happen is a repeat of 1968, where Richard Nixon at one point actually went out to the National Mall and had a dialogue with anti-war demonstrators. Nobody's fathoming we're going to see that from the president. But there is, at the very least, even among some of the president's supporters and aides, that he's tone deaf to what's going on.
So what impact is this going to have on the election? Of course, Minnesota is largely a Democrat state where this broke out, and there are lots of other big Democrat states protesting. So might this impact the November election?
I don't think there's any doubt it will. In what way, we don't know. November is still a long way off. We're still dealing with the pandemic, of course, and how is that going to play out? How are people going to rank the president's handling of that? And what's going to happen between now and then with this domestic unrest? Is this going to fizzle out in a few days, or is it going to be exacerbated? And will the president's rhetoric just be adding fuel to the fire? Maybe it emboldens his base and gets people out to vote who have supported the president, thinking that they need to keep him in. But does it alienate not only minority populations in the United States, but those so-called suburban soccer moms that are seen so critical in some of the swing states, especially in the upper Midwest?
Steve Herman in Alexandria, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, Bev.
Well, protests demanding justice over the death of George Floyd have spread beyond the US. Now, demonstrators marched through downtown Montreal in Canada, denouncing racial injustice and police brutality. It was a peaceful event until some clashed with police, who responded with pepper spray and tear gas.
Black lives matter! Black lives matter! Black lives matter!
Closer to home, thousands took to the streets of Auckland, New Zealand, to protest against the death of Mr. Floyd. Meantime, social distancing rules were abandoned in London as hundreds of demonstrators marched in support of the protests across the US. Lockdown restrictions are being further relaxed, with some students to return to school today. But members of the scientific body advising the government say it's too soon, as the rate of coronavirus infections remains high. Our Europe correspondent Samantha Hawley.
They came in solidarity as the protests raged in the US. In London, hundreds took to the streets, marching from Trafalgar Square to the US Embassy.
Why can't the government protect us as much as they want to protect Dominic Cummings?
Social distancing disappeared as the anger bubbled over. But still, in the UK, the coronavirus crisis is dominating, with the death toll now passing 38,000. For months, Boris Johnson has been criticised for not doing more to contain the virus.
Good evening.
Now he's been warned again that he's moving too fast as lockdown restrictions are lifted further. This week in England, primary schools will reopen for reception, Year 1 and Year 6 students. Gatherings of up to 6 people will be allowed outdoors, and 2 million vulnerable residents who've been shielding will be allowed outside.
Obviously, this is a sensitive moment, but we can't just stay in lockdown forever.
The government